The meeting invite hit my inbox at 6:47 a.m. Not 6:45, not 7 o'clock, but 6:47. That's the kind of time chosen by someone who thinks precision equals professionalism, but really just screams, I have no idea what I'm doing. The subject line read, Strategic Workforce Optimization, Mandatory Attendance. I knew right then my 15 years at DataCore Systems were about to become a footnote in some MBA's PowerPoint deck. My name's Scott Palmer. I'm 47, and I've been writing code since these kids were learning to tie their shoes. But apparently, that makes me legacy. I'd seen this movie before. Back in 2018, DataCore went through what they called right-sizing. Translated from corporate speak, that meant they laid off half the infrastructure team and left me scrambling to keep everything running solo. I remember working 18-hour days for 3 straight weeks, patching systems that were never designed to run with skeleton crews, fielding calls from panicked clients whose orders weren't processing. That's when I realized something important. Companies will always choose short-term savings over long-term stability. So I started building my own stability, not revenge, protection. I called it the Safe Mode Protocol, and I buried it deep in the Orion Ops licensing system like a digital insurance policy. The protocol was actually brilliant in its simplicity. If the primary architect's employment status changed to terminated without proper transition planning, the system would automatically switch to read-only mode. No data loss, no security breaches, just a gentle pause while everyone figured out what they'd actually lost. I documented it in the Disaster Recovery Manual, mentioned it in quarterly reviews, even brought it up during architecture planning sessions. But nobody listens to the guy who just keeps everything working. They take that for granted. Walking into conference room B that morning, I carried my usual coffee and the kind of calm that comes from having contingency. Plans for your contingency plans. Across the table sat Jason Mitchell, our 31-year-old CTO, who joined the company 8 months ago with a Stanford MBA and approximately zero understanding of how our systems actually worked. Next to him, Lisa Rodriguez from HR clutched a manila folder like it contained nuclear launch codes. I'd worked with Lisa for 6 years. She was good people, but today she looked like someone who'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Scott, Jason began, flashing that rehearsed smile they must teach in business school. You've been an incredible asset to our journey here at DataCore, but as we modernize our infrastructure and embrace cloud-native solutions, some legacy roles are, well, evolving. There it was. Legacy. Like I was a dusty server in some forgotten closet instead of the guy who'd kept their revenue stream flowing for a decade and a half. We're transitioning to automated deployment pipelines and AI-assisted monitoring, Lisa added, reading from her script, like she was announcing flight delays. This is a restructuring-based separation, not performance-related. I took a sip of coffee and waited. 20 years in tech teaches you to listen for what they're not saying. They weren't replacing me with better engineers. They were replacing me with buzzwords and prayer. The thing is, Jason continued, leaning forward like he was about to share the secret to cold fusion, modern DevOps practices can handle what used to require dedicated legacy maintenance. We're containerizing everything, moving to microservices on AWS. It's really exciting stuff. I almost asked him if he knew what a race condition was, or if he'd ever debugged a memory leak at 3 a.m., while customers screamed about downtime, but I didn't. You can't explain 15 years of institutional knowledge to someone who thinks Docker containers are magic. Any questions? Lisa asked, sliding the separation package across the table like she was serving me divorce papers. I flipped through the document, scanning the legal boilerplate and severance details. Then I saw it. The termination date was exactly 3 days before my stock options were set to vest. 3 days. After 15 years of building their infrastructure from the ground up, missing family dinners to fix their emergencies, and turning their chaotic startup systems into enterprise-grade architecture, they were cutting me loose 72 hours before I'd see any real benefit from the company's success. My jaw clenched, but I kept my voice steady. This termination date, it's very specific. Jason's smile flickered for just a moment. We wanted to complete the transition before the end of the fiscal quarter. Clean books, you know? Right, clean books. Not clean enough to include paying out stock options to the guy who'd made their growth possible. I need some time to think about this, I said, closing the folder. Well, the decision's been made, Jason replied, his MBA confidence returning. But we'd love to have you train the replacement team before your departure. Knowledge transfer is really important to us. Knowledge transfer. This kid thought he could download 15 years of accumulated wisdom into a PowerPoint presentation and call it even. Who's the replacement team? I asked. Brandon Walsh is going to be our new senior DevOps engineer. Really sharp guy, actually. 6 months of intensive training at Tech Boost Academy. 6 months. I'd spent longer than that just documenting the quirks of our legacy payment processing system. Sure, I said, standing up. I'd be happy to show them around. Jason looked relieved. Fantastic. Brandon starts Monday. We'll set up some transition meetings. As I walked back to my desk, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Not anger, I was past that. Not fear, I'd been planning for this. What I felt was anticipation. They wanted to see what modern DevOps could accomplish without legacy support. They were about to get a masterclass in the difference between managing systems and understanding them. I sat down at my workstation and opened the Orion Ops core documentation. Buried on page 47, section 4.2.3 of the Disaster Recovery Manual was a single paragraph about the safe mode protocol. 2 sentences explaining that the system included protective measures to prevent data corruption during transition periods. Nobody had ever asked me to elaborate on what those protective measures actually were. They'd just assumed I was being overly cautious. Typical legacy thinking, always worried about edge cases that probably wouldn't happen. Well, they were about to learn why those edge cases matter. Monday morning arrived with Brandon Walsh, Tech Boost Academy's finest graduate. He showed up wearing a hoodie that probably cost more than my monthly car payment and carrying a MacBook covered in startup stickers. The kid had enthusiasm, I'll give him that. He also had the kind of confidence that comes from never having been responsible for keeping $1 million revenue stream online at 2 a.m. So this is the famous Orion Ops, he said, settling into the chair next to mine. I've been reading about microservices architecture. This monolithic approach is really outdated, don't you think? I pulled up the system dashboard. Let's start with the basics. This is our monitoring interface. Green means everything's running normally. Yellow indicates performance warnings. Red means someone's about to have a very bad day. Brandon nodded, typing notes. Cool, and this all gets replaced with containerized services, right? Much more scalable. Sure, I said. Tell me what you see here. He squinted at the screen. Looks like server metrics, CPU usage, memory, network traffic. Those are the obvious ones. What about these indicators here? I pointed to a cluster of widgets showing database connection pools, cache hit ratios, and transaction queue depths. Database stuff? I spent the next 3 hours walking him through systems that had taken me years to understand fully. The custom load balancer I'd built to handle their specific traffic patterns, the data synchronization routines that kept their inventory accurate across 6 different warehouses, the payment processing pipeline that had to interface with legacy banking systems dating back to the Clinton administration. Brandon took a lot of notes. He asked good questions too, which gave me hope that maybe he wasn't completely out of his depth. But every so often he'd suggest modernizing something that was working perfectly fine, or replacing a battle-tested component with whatever trendy framework he'd learned about last week. Why don't you just use Kubernetes for orchestration? He asked during lunch. Because our deployment requirements are more complex than spinning up web servers, I explained. We have stateful services with strict ordering dependencies. You can't just throw everything in containers and hope for the best. But Docker makes everything so much easier. I looked at this kid, really looked at him. 6 months ago, he was probably delivering pizzas or working retail. Nothing wrong with that, but now he was tasked with maintaining systems that processed 50,000 transactions per day for a company with 200 employees and their families, depending on those paychecks. Tuesday was more of the same. I showed Brandon the deployment pipeline, the backup procedures, the disaster recovery protocols. I walked him through the incident response playbook I'd written after spending too many nights on conference calls with angry customers. This seems really complicated, he said, scrolling through the runbook. Wouldn't it be simpler to just restart everything if there's a problem? You could do that, I said. Of course, restarting the payment processor means losing any transactions currently in progress, and restarting the inventory system means temporarily showing zero stock for everything, which tends to panic customers. Oh, right. By Wednesday, I could see the panic starting to set in. Brandon was beginning to understand the scope of what he was inheriting, and it was like watching someone realize they'd volunteered to perform brain surgery after taking a first aid class. "There's so much to remember," he said, staring at his notebook filled with increasingly frantic scribbles. "That's why we document everything," I told him. "Most of this stuff is in the knowledge base. But what if something goes wrong that's not in the documentation?" I looked at him for a moment. This was the question that separated real engineers from people who just knew how to follow tutorials. "Then you figure it out," I said. "You dig through logs, you trace through code, you test hypotheses until you find the root cause. That's the job." He didn't look reassured. Thursday morning, Jason called me into his office. He was sitting behind his standing desk, because of course he had a standing desk, with a protein smoothie and an expression that suggested he was starting to have second thoughts about something. "How's the knowledge transfer going?" he asked. "Brandon's picking things up," I said diplomatically. "He's got good instincts." "Great, great. The thing is, we've been thinking maybe we should extend your transition period, just to make sure everything goes smoothly." I almost smiled. "Extended how? Maybe another week, 2 weeks? We want to be really thorough about this." "I appreciate the consideration, Jason, but my last day is Friday. That was your timeline, remember?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Right, but if we needed you to stay longer, that could be arranged. We could adjust your separation date, maybe discuss some consulting arrangements." "My stock options vest on Monday," I pointed out. "Well, yes, but we could work something out. Maybe a retention bonus?" Now I did smile. "You want to pay me to stay and train my replacement so you don't have to honor my stock options?" "It's not like that." "It's exactly like that." I stood up. "Don't worry, Jason. I'm sure Brandon will do fine." Friday afternoon, I cleaned out my desk while the office buzzed with its usual end-of-week energy. People said their goodbyes, exchanged contact information, made plans to keep in touch. A few of the senior developers pulled me aside to tell me this was a mistake, that management didn't understand what they were losing. I appreciated the sentiment, but it was too late for that. Brandon stopped by my desk around 4 p.m., looking like a man who just realized he was about to jump out of an airplane without checking his parachute. "Scott, I'm really nervous about this," he admitted. "What if something breaks over the weekend?" "Then you'll fix it," I said, packing the last of my personal items. "You've got the documentation, you've got the run books, and you've got my contact info if there's a real emergency." "But what if I can't figure it out?" I looked at this kid who was about to inherit 15 years of my life's work, and I felt something I hadn't expected: sympathy. This wasn't his fault. He hadn't asked to be thrown into the deep end of enterprise systems management with 6 months of boot camp training. "Brandon," I said, "you'll be fine. The systems are more robust than you think, and if something really goes sideways, there are safeguards in place." "What kind of safeguards?" "The kind that keep companies from destroying themselves through poor planning," I said. At 5:47 p.m., I logged out of my workstation for the final time. The system automatically updated my employment status from active to separated in the HR database. That timestamp would trigger a cascade of authentication checks across our infrastructure, eventually reaching the safe mode protocol I'd embedded 6 years earlier. I went home, cracked open a beer, and waited for the phone to ring. The call came at 11:23 p.m., just as I was settling in to watch the late news. Brandon's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Scott, we've got a major problem. The entire production environment is acting weird. All the services are showing read-only status, and I can't deploy anything. The deployment pipeline just sits there spinning." I took a sip of my beer. "Sounds like the safe mode protocol activated." "The what?" "Safe mode protocol. It's a failsafe I built into the system. When the primary infrastructure architect leaves without proper transition planning, Orion Ops automatically switches to safe mode to prevent data corruption or security breaches. Silence on the other end. Then, can you turn it off? Not remotely. You'd need administrative access to the core license verification system. We have admin access. Jason gave me all the credentials." I almost laughed. Brandon, you have user admin access. This requires architect-level credentials, which are tied to my employment status and digital certificates. But I can't fix anything. Orders are processing, but I can't update inventory. I can't deploy the hotfix for the payment processor bug. I can't even restart services without them reverting to the last known good configuration. That's the point, I explained. Safe mode prevents inexperienced administrators from making changes that could destabilize critical systems. It's actually protecting the company. Scott, please. I'm in way over my head here. Jason's going to fire me. I felt a pang of sympathy for the kid. This really wasn't his fault. Brandon, document everything that's happening. Screenshot the error messages, save the log files. Make sure Jason understands this is a system design feature, not a failure. He's not going to understand that. Then make him understand. This is what happens when you remove institutional knowledge without proper planning. At 2:15 a.m., my phone rang again. This time it was Jason, and he sounded like he'd been drinking espresso through an IV drip. Scott, what the hell is happening to our systems? I told Brandon. The safe mode protocol activated when my employment status changed. It's designed to prevent system instability during transition periods. This is sabotage. Jason, I documented the safe mode protocol in the disaster recovery manual 3 years ago. It's on page 47, section 4.2.3. Your legal team approved it as part of our business continuity planning. Another long silence. Can you disable it? I'm no longer an employee. I don't have access to company systems. Scott, we need you to come in and fix this. I was made redundant, remember? Modern DevOps practices were supposed to handle everything. This is... He paused, probably realizing that threatening me wasn't going to help. Look, we need to talk. Can you be here at 8 a.m.? I'll think about it. Saturday morning, I got 3 more calls before I even had my coffee. The first was from Lisa Rodriguez, asking if there was some kind of misunderstanding about the safe mode protocol. The second was from Patrick Williams, the CEO, trying to sound calm while clearly having some kind of internal meltdown. The third was from our biggest client, wondering why their Saturday morning inventory update hadn't processed. I took my time getting ready, shaved carefully, put on my best suit, even polished my shoes. If I was going back to DataCore, I was going to look like someone they should have thought twice about firing. The executive conference room was packed when I walked in at exactly 8 a.m. Patrick sat at the head of the table, flanked by the CFO, COO, and Jason, who looked like he'd been awake for 72 straight hours. Lisa was there too, probably to make sure nobody said anything that would get the company sued. Scott, Patrick began, his voice carefully controlled. We need to understand what's happening with our systems. I sat down and placed a folder on the table. The safe mode protocol activated exactly as designed. When the primary architect is terminated without proper succession planning, the system protects itself and the company's data by preventing potentially dangerous changes during the transition period. How long does this last? The CFO asked. Until the original architect is reinstated or a proper handover process is completed with board oversight. Jason leaned forward. We can't run a business like this. We've lost $450,000 in potential revenue over the past 18 hours. Our vendor agreements have penalty clauses that kick in if we can't process orders normally. How much in penalties? Patrick asked. About $180,000 so far, and it gets worse every day this continues. I nodded sympathetically. The protocol was designed to make executives think carefully before removing critical infrastructure personnel. Apparently, it's working. This is extortion, Jason said. No, I replied calmly. This is consequence. You decided my experience was worthless and that a boot camp graduate could replace 15 years of institutional knowledge. The system disagrees. Patrick looked at the papers Lisa had spread in front of him, probably legal assessments of their position. What would it take to resolve this? I'd spent all Friday night thinking about that question, and most of Saturday morning refining my answer. The safe mode protocol requires the original architect to be actively engaged with the system, not consulting, actual employment with appropriate decision-making authority. So you want your job back? I want a job back, with some modifications. I opened my folder and slid a single sheet across the table. CTO position, $220,000 base salary, 15% equity stake, and a 5-year employment contract with change of control protections. Jason's face went through several color changes. That's my position? Was your position, I corrected. You'll be transitioning to senior engineering manager. Still a good role, but with responsibilities more suited to your experience level. The CFO was doing mental math, probably calculating how much money they were hemorrhaging every hour this dragged on. The equity stake alone is worth more than your entire severance package. My severance package was designed to cheat me out of my stock options, I pointed out. This is market rate for someone who can actually keep your systems running. Patrick looked around the table, reading faces. The COO was nodding. He'd been in operations long enough to understand the value of stable infrastructure. The CFO was still calculating, but her expression suggested the numbers worked in my favor. There's one more thing, I said. Brandon Walsh gets to keep his job, but with proper mentoring this time. 6 months of supervised responsibility before he handles anything critical on his own. Jason started to object, but Patrick held up a hand. Deal, he said. I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop. I'll need a few minutes to safely transition the system out of safe mode, and I'll need my access credentials restored immediately. How long? The CFO asked. Give me an hour. Systems will be fully operational by 10 a.m. It took exactly 47 minutes to restore full functionality. I connected to the secure admin console, entered my biometric credentials, and began the careful process of transitioning Orion Ops out of safe mode. Services came back online one by one. Payment processing, inventory management, customer notifications. The monitoring dashboards returned to their familiar green glow, like Christmas lights coming to life. That's it, I announced to the room full of executives. We're fully operational. The relief was almost tangible. Patrick actually smiled for the first time all morning. The CFO immediately started typing on her phone, probably notifying key clients that their orders would process normally again. Scott, I want to apologize, Patrick said. We clearly didn't appreciate the complexity of what you'd built here, or the risks involved in this transition. I closed my laptop and looked around the table. It's not about complexity, Patrick. It's about understanding that systems aren't just code and servers. They're institutional knowledge, accumulated wisdom from years of handling edge cases and crisis situations. You can't download that into a new hire, no matter how smart they are. Jason, who'd been silent through most of the restoration process, finally spoke up. I still think we were right about modernizing the infrastructure, container orchestration, microservices architecture. These aren't just buzzwords, they're industry best practices. You're absolutely right, I said, which clearly wasn't the response he expected. We should modernize, but you don't replace the foundation while people are still living in the house. You plan the transition carefully, you maintain continuity, and you make sure the people who understand the current systems are involved in building the new ones. Over the next hour, we hammered out the details. My official title would be Chief Technology Officer, with Jason transitioning to VP of Engineering, still a senior role, but one focused on future development rather than maintaining critical infrastructure. Brandon would work directly under me for the next 6 months, learning not just the technical aspects of the job, but the judgment that comes from experience. What about the modernization plan? Jason asked. We'll do it right this time, I said. Gradual migration, comprehensive testing, proper rollback procedures. It'll take 18 months instead of 6, but we won't risk the business in the process. As the meeting broke up, Lisa approached me with a new employment contract. I'm sorry about how this all went down, she said quietly. I tried to argue against the timing, but it's not your fault, Lisa. You were following orders. Still, I should have pushed harder. I signed the contract and handed it back. Sometimes these things work out the way they're supposed to. My first week as CTO was interesting, to put it mildly. Word had gotten out in the tech community about what happened at DataCore. Not the full details, but enough that I started getting calls from other companies. Apparently, there were a lot of organizations out there that had made similar mistakes and were looking for someone who understood the value of institutional knowledge. A logistics company in Seattle wanted to hire me to rebuild their supply chain management system after their modernization project had collapsed. A fintech startup in Austin was looking for a technical advisor who could help them avoid the scaling pitfalls that had killed their last 3 attempts at expansion. I turned them all down. For now. Brandon proved to be a quick learner once he understood the scope of what he was dealing with. The kid had good instincts, and more importantly, he wasn't too proud to ask questions when he didn't understand something. "Why didn't anyone document this stuff properly?" he asked one afternoon, scrolling through some legacy code I'd written to handle a particularly bizarre edge case in our payment processing. "Because when you're fighting fires, you don't always have time to write poetry about it," I explained. "You fix the problem, you move on to the next crisis, and you hope you'll remember the details when something similar happens again. But that's not sustainable. No, it's not. That's why we're going to do better going forward." 3 months into my new role, Jason approached me with something I hadn't expected: humility. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I thought you were just resistant to change, stuck in old ways of doing things. I didn't realize how much I didn't know." I looked at this guy who'd tried to replace me with automation and good intentions. "Jason, you weren't wrong about needing to modernize. You were just wrong about thinking it would be easy. I've been reading about technical debt," he said. "I never really understood what it meant before." "Technical debt is like financial debt," I explained. "Sometimes you take shortcuts to meet a deadline or solve an immediate problem. That's fine, as long as you pay it back later by cleaning up the code and documenting the decisions. But if you just keep accumulating debt without ever paying it down, the interest eventually kills you." Exactly. 6 months after my return, we completed the first phase of our modernization project. We'd successfully containerized our customer service portal and moved it to a hybrid cloud infrastructure. It was a small step, but it proved that we could modernize without destroying what we'd built. More importantly, we documented every decision, every trade-off, every lesson learned along the way. The next team that inherited these systems wouldn't have to reverse engineer our thinking from cryptic code comments and tribal knowledge. These days, when young engineers ask me about job security, in tech, I tell them something I learned the hard way. Don't just write code, build safeguards, document not just what you did, but why you did it, and never let anyone convince you that experience is a liability. The industry loves to talk about disruption, about moving fast and breaking things. But what they often forget is that some things shouldn't be broken. Some systems represent years of accumulated wisdom about edge cases, user behavior, and the messy realities of business requirements. The safe mode protocol wasn't revenge, though I'll admit there was a certain satisfaction in watching it work exactly as designed. It was responsibility, my way of making sure the company couldn't accidentally destroy itself through bad decision-making. In a world full of people trying to automate everything and move fast at all costs, sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is build systems that force everyone to slow down and think. Because being irreplaceable isn't about hoarding knowledge or making yourself indispensable through complexity. It's about understanding that the real value isn't in the code you write. It's in the wisdom to know when not to write it, when to preserve what works, and when to protect the things that matter from the people who don't yet understand their importance. Legacy isn't something to be ashamed of. It's something to be proud of. It means you built something that lasted, something that mattered enough for people to want to preserve it. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it means you built something smart enough to protect itself. The most dangerous employee isn't the loud one who complains. It's the quiet one who listens, documents everything, and builds systems that outlast corporate politics. In a world obsessed with replacing experience with automation, remember this: you can't download wisdom, you can't containerize judgment, and you definitely can't outsource the kind of foresight that comes from surviving every disaster twice.